I'd like to let you know about a few upcoming programs. At the end of this month, we have Cultivating Soul, a day with New York Times bestselling author Thomas More on October 27th in Glen Ellen and October 28th in downtown Chicago. On November 3rd, we have Water is Life, Not Just a Commodity, Jung and the Native American Soul with Sarah Sage, LPC, LMHC. On November 5th, we have a special event at the Lyric Opera of Chicago. Tickets include seats on the front main floor of the opera, as well as a pre-opera talk by Jungian analyst George Hoganson. And in December, we have a special lecture by Lionel Corbett, MD, The Soul in Anguish, a depth psychological approach to suffering. Because we have Lionel Corbett speaking in December, this podcast episode will be the first part of a series that he did with Cathy Rives. For more information about any of those events, visit our website, jungchicago.org. Welcome to the Jungian Anthology Podcast, analytical psychology seminars from the archives of the C.G. Jung Institute of Chicago. Jungian Psychology and Kohut's Self-Psychology with Lionel Corbett, MD, and Cathy Rives, MD. This episode is the first session of the series Jungian Psychology and Kohut's Self-Psychology. The psychoanalytic methods of self-psychology as developed by Heinz Kohut examine the development and the developmental disturbances of self-esteem and confidence, the formation and malformation of guiding ideals, empathy for the thoughts and feelings of others, initiative and creativity, and even sense of humor and wisdom. Lionel Corbett and Cathy Rives compare and contrast Jung's theory of the self, as well as general aspects of Jungian psychology, with Kohut's self-psychology, which is rapidly becoming a mainstream alternative to both classical psychoanalytic drive theory and ego psychology. They also utilize case studies as well as fairytale and myth analysis to help illustrate these theories. It was recorded in 1989. Lionel Corbett, MD, is a professor of depth psychology at the Pacifica Graduate Institute. His primary interests are the religious functions of the psyche, especially the way in which personal religious experience is relevant to the individual psychology, the development of psychotherapy as a spiritual practice, and the interface of Jungian psychology and contemporary psychoanalytic thought. He is the author of numerous professional papers and 4 books: Psyche and the Sacred, Spirituality Beyond Religion, The Religious Function of the Psyche, The Sacred Cauldron, Psychotherapy as a Spiritual Practice, and most recently, The Soul in Anguish, Psychotherapeutic Approaches to Suffering. Cathy Rives, MD, is a psychiatrist, Jungian analyst, and past chair of the Clinical Psychology Program at the Pacifica Graduate Institute. She is particularly interested in Jungian developmental theory, a way of working analytically that integrates Jungian theory, object relations, and self-psychology. We will have links in the show notes for the complete series, as well as more seminars by Dr. Corbett and Dr. Rives.
Or maybe I should just speak for myself, I've found, especially in my clinical work, that using what I've learned from Jungian theory and what I've learned from Kohutian theory has allowed me to do more, to work with more types of people, to go a little further than just one theory alone. When you think about Jungian therapy, if we look at it in a clinical way for a while, the sort of process of Jungian therapy is to look at, understand, explore manifestations of the unconscious whatever's coming up, whatever's pushing forward and being expressed. Now, when Jung describes this in the kind of classical Jungian way of looking at unconscious manifestations is through dreams, through the technique he developed of active imagination, through looking at myths and fairy tales, looking at different cultures, different religions, and those are all manifestations of the unconscious. But another way in which the unconscious manifests itself is through relationships and through certain patterns and ways that we all relate to each other. And this happens in a therapeutic relationship, just like in other sorts of relationships, but it's often very intense in a therapeutic relationship. And what Kohut has done has been to look at that therapeutic relationship and describe certain patterns that he saw over and over and over again. And we're going to talk about those patterns and describe them and look at them as being archetypal in terms of Jungian language. And this has been real helpful for me as a therapist, because so much of what goes on in the therapy is not just the reporting of dreams, but how the dreams are reported to me, and how the person feels telling me the dream, and how the person feels being with me in the room. And Jungian therapy has not been as helpful for me in dealing with those kinds of unconscious manifestations as Kohutian theory has been. So that's where I'm coming from with it.
Maybe I could just go on a little bit on that same theme. That many of us value Jung very much because he has a transpersonal approach, and because you can see the transpersonal background to the individual. And that's very important if you look at the psyche from a religious point of view, which many of us do. But that's the great strength of it. The problem with it is that you can't ever really divorce the personal from the transpersonal. And you always need what we call a personalistic psychology. You need an approach to the individual that's based on what goes on between people rather than what goes on between the person and the transpersonal, or between man and God, depending on how you want to say it. But you have to have both. And we think that in the classical Jungian literature there was too much emphasis on the transpersonal with some neglect of the personal. And what we're trying to do is bring the two together, because we don't think they can ever really be separated, but you need really a rather different language, although they interpenetrate. So as Cathy said, we'll look at the personalistic material that Kohut describes and try and explain what we think is the transpersonal background to that from a Jungian point of view. I think that will be of interest to people who are interested in the religious aspects, because that's actually our interest as well. But there's no point in being interested in religion and knowing a lot about the transpersonal and knowing a lot about Jungian symbolic thought if you don't know how to sit and talk to somebody. So Kohut's very useful for that.
The other thing we're going to do, it's not in this, but I think we might do it, is the place where Jung talks about the transference is in volume 16, where he likens it to the alchemical process and to the Rosarian pictures. And
so we might bring them together.
We might be able to talk about those, and in terms of how they fit into Kohut's thinking.
Yeah. So for people who know volume 16, Jung's work on the transference is in volume 16. The book is called The Practice of Psychotherapy. And the second half of the book is on...
Yeah, hopefully we could get to that.
Yeah. But what we've done is look at those pictures, which are alchemical from a Kohutian point of view. Okay, so that's how we align ourselves. Any comments about that so far? We'd like this to be as much of an interchange.
Feel free to, if you have questions, or everyone has a different amount of exposure to Jung and to Kohut. So
also, as we get along, if you have cases, it would be useful to bring up cases.
If you have an easy definition of transpersonal.
That's a good question to start out with.
Well, it's not an easy question. Something which really has two aspects to it. One is something that extends beyond the personal, and another is that it's common to all people. Okay. So when we talk about the difference between spirit and soul, we'll go into that some more. Are we ever going to get to spirit and soul?
Hopefully.
We should try and do that. In the sense that spirit is transpersonal and soul is personal. We'll talk about it that way.
Yeah.
There are many of... Oh, I'm sorry, it's another question.
I'm sorry, this is very logistic question. I can actually see neither of you.
Here,
You're not used to disembodied voices.
Yeah, is that better? Okay.
Looks like little Bob.
Yeah. People on the stairway, I don't know.
Seems a shame to waste it.
Yeah, they're sitting on a chair up here.
The price is the same here.
In fact, if you come at the end, you get there.
And there's a chair up front. Oh, good.
Classic religious spirituality.
There are lots of Jungian analysts who are very interested in personalistic psychologists, and many of them are interested in Kohut, many of them are interested in Robert Langs, many of them are interested in Melanie Klein, for this reason that many of us feel that you need some kind of personalistic psychology, and there are lots of points of contact with Jung and Kohut, but as you were pointing out, there are some important differences. We'll try and bring them out. One of the most interesting points of similarity is that Kohut has been, in the psychoanalytic literature, has been regarded as metaphysical and a defector from the psychoanalytic establishment, which of course was exactly Jung's fate in 1912 or whenever that was. Kohut, interestingly enough, when he was writing about why there was such anger towards him among the psychoanalytic establishment, said he thought that a lot of the classical analysts in their own training analysis had such terrible experiences and such poor analytic experiences that they were left with huge narcissistic deficits. So belonging to a community which adhered to a particular philosophy made up for the narcissistic deficit that was never healed during their own analysis. In other words, it just made them feel good to belong to a sort of Me Too, what we would now call a twinship community. We'll talk more about that. And this accounts for the kind of rigid adherence to classical theory and some of the opposition to Kohut nowadays, and also we think to some of the opposition to Jung in his day. Okay, so
but what's interesting is that now people who have trained by Kohut and consider themselves Kohutians put Jung in the same category of kind of the black sheep that their own sort of mentor was put into by the classical Freudians. Yeah. So they haven't healed that yet.
They haven't healed that. No. There's another very important point of similarity between Jung and Kohut, which is that the issues that Jung broke with Freud about are exactly the same issues that Kohut breaks with mainstream psychoanalysis about. These are the notion of drive and drive defense psychology. Are you familiar with that theory of drive defense psychology?
Drive?
I don't know whether to explain terms or not. Shall I explain what that is? There is a theory in classical psychoanalysis which says that if this line represents the unconscious and this represents consciousness, but in the unconscious there are drives, which Freud wrote about as id, sexuality and aggression. And these drives are always trying to break out into consciousness. And that because they're unacceptable to consciousness, we defend against them. And that a lot of our mental life is the struggle between the wish to be sexual and aggressive and the defense against that. Okay, and that's, in one line, that's what's called drive defense psychology. Well, and Kohut really gave that up, and that was one of the main things that Jung and Freud broke over, which is very interesting historically. And the emphasis on a purely sexual theory of neurosis, which was one of the major things that Jung and Freud, I guess people are familiar with this, one of the major things that they broke over was Freud's insistence on the sexual theory of neurosis and Jung's arguing against this. And now Kohut comes along and says again that a purely sexual theory won't do of psychopathology. Same point that Jung had made. And the importance of the concept of the self, a third point of similarity, which of course Jung stressed and is primary in Kohut as well. Okay, so these historically these are very, very interesting and important similarities. And the other thing is the notion of psychic energy. You remember that Freud thought this libido or psychic energy was purely sexual, and Kohut has a completely different theory of psychic energy. So there are lots of important issues. Okay, now where shall we go?
Well, we're going to talk about the self.
Okay.
And maybe spend most of the time on the psychological notion of the self.
Okay. So maybe what we ought to do is present an overview of Kohut's view of the self. Are people familiar with Jung's view of the self? We can go through that too.
We can go through both and then go back more in detail over Kohut.
So then what we have to do is we have to go through Kohut's view of the self, then Jung's view of the self, and then try and show how they're the same and different, which will take some time. Should we start? What should we start with?
Why don't we start with Kohut?
No,
I'll start. For Kohut, the development of the self, what he calls a cohesive nuclear self, is occurs at a certain age. Talks about between 18 months and 2.5 years, and is a necessary step in order to become a kind of healthy, functioning person. He actually, in a way similar to Jung, talks about the self in ways that are difficult to pin down. He says it's something that can't really be completely described. He calls it a felt center of initiative and motivation, a sort of place inside where one feels continuous in space and in time. It's made up of intrapsychic structures, memories that one calls one's own and that you identify as yourself.
But it's developed by accretion.
Right. It's developed. It forms at a certain age, and he feels that it develops along two poles that we'll get more into detail about, poles of mirroring and poles of idealization. And he feels that these are two sort of innate developmental lines that unfold within each of us that have to be met by objects, what he calls self-objects in the environment, and that we have this need to be mirrored and this need to idealize, which we'll go into a little bit more. And we we have to have these functions provided for us by this outer self object. And the way our own self is formed is by these experiences of being mirrored, experiences of idealizing, experiences of an empathic self-object that we internalize bit by bit, so that we kind of build this structure within ourselves that is a self that can then perform these functions for ourselves, so we don't have to have these objects in the outer world.
So that's the first major point of difference between Jung and Kohut. That Kohut says the self is built up from an outside experience which is internalized.
Now, the place where there's a similarity is this idea that there's this innate need, innate pattern, these innate poles along which development proceeds. That's beginning to sound a little Jungian, because that's speaking of something that isn't built up, but of something that's right there at birth, and that gradually unfolds and has to be met by the environment.
So is that a clear difference? That for Jung the self is just there at birth, and for Kohut it's built up by accretion, by experience. Okay. So when Kohut talks about these two poles, which we'll deal with in detail, the mirroring and idealizing poles of the self, he has no explanation for where they come from. He doesn't try and explain where they come from. And if you push to Kohutian and say, where do they come from, where do they come from, where do they come from, they will get annoyed with you and say it's wired into the brain.
Hardwiring.
Okay. But the problem with that view is that it reduces these intensely psychological needs to brain. And many of us would object to that for obvious philosophical reasons. Okay. So, but the fact that he says there are innate psychological needs is a similarity with Jung's notion of an innate self present at birth, except that for Jung, that innate self is far more complex than just these two things that Kohut talks about. But I doubt whether Jung would have argued that these things that Kohut talks about are certainly part of it. So we think that Kohut has just gotten onto two parts of Jung's self, but he's not talking about the same thing exactly. Okay? Is that a clear difference? Yeah?
It's difficult because they're both using the same word, self, to describe really very different concepts, and the concepts meet, but they're different, and that's why you'll often see in the Jungian literature people talking about the Jungian self and capitalizing it, and that's to sort of signify this, your question, this transpersonal aspect to it, this sort of larger common structural aspect to it. And then you'll see Jungians talk about the personal self or the little less self, and they're often talking more there about the concept that Kohut has described.
So if you hear us talk about big S self, little s self, when we talk about big S self, we mean transpersonal self, okay, which is very similar to the notion of Atman, Brahman. People who know that. It's not quite the same as in that ballpark. And when we talk about small s self or personal self, we mean me and you. Okay.
When Kohut, one of the ways that Kohut's notion of the little s self is very important is that you'll see people, you'll have patients who don't have that structure didn't ever form. And it's a little hard to imagine because we kind of take it for granted that we are who we are, and we're here today and we were there yesterday, and those two things are connected. But when this structure doesn't develop, people end up without that sense. If you've ever had the experience of being lost, if you've ever been tremendously anxious,
in a foreign country, lost, not knowing the language. Have you ever had that experience? That's when you don't have a sense of self. And it shows you how dependent we are on the surroundings for a cohesive sense of self.
Or if you've ever taken hallucinogenic drugs, or if you've ever had experiences where you've become terribly confused or anxious or lost sense of meaning, if you've been doing something that felt like the purpose of your life and the meaning of your life, and then you begin to doubt it, you've experienced tremendous doubts about who you are or what purpose you have for being here. Those kinds of experiences are similar to what Kohut talks about in terms of loss of self, fragmentation of self, lack of a nuclear self.
And they're also the same as what the primitive people call loss of soul.
Loss of soul. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we think that when primitive people are talking about loss of soul, they're talking about fragmentation of the self, states of depression, depletion, exhaustion, fragmentation. Anyway, maybe we ought to go on with our
the
two poles.
Yeah, why don't you do that?
Should I do the mirror?
Mm-hmm.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Would the ego for Kohut be synonymous? The self for Kohut. Would that be synonymous with the ego? Is it the conscious?
It's similar but not synonymous, because Kohut's self is both conscious and unconscious, contains both. But the idea of the ego as being the I-ness, the identity, in that way it's similar.
The Kohutians have given up the use of the word ego. They never use it anymore. They say
The Jungian usage of
Jungians
ego.
use it, but they mean something different by it. The Kohutians say it's a redundant word because it doesn't say anything. If you can talk about the person, you may as well talk about the person, which is the self. And
but I assume that for Jung, the self was something that you really never could get to.
Fully.
Mm-hmm.
Fully. Yeah, that's an important qualifier because you can to some extent. The ego for Jung means the field of personal consciousness. Okay, that's a rather narrow meaning. But so in self-psychology, the Kohutians don't use the term ego. If you want a discussion of this, it's in Arnold Goldberg's book, Goldberg and Ghetto, Models of the Mind, where they talk about these two concepts being at different levels of abstraction, having different usefulness and different applications. But when we talk about personal self, to go into this in great detail would be a long story, but for a lot of the ego psychologists, the self was a representation within the ego, and the ego was superordinate. Okay? But for the self-psychologists, the self is superordinate. It's not simply a representation, and the ego is just redundant. Okay? And so the personal self includes the person, the body, consciousness, and unconscious. And I suppose it would include what we call ego functions, except they think that's a redundant term. See.
Any other questions?
Are we clear so far? So let me talk a little bit about these two poles. In his first book, he talked about a bipolar self, and he said, later on he added a third pole. It's not quite a pole to it. He said that in the child, on this side, there is what he called archaic grandiosity, which is roughly synonymous with exhibitionism. Okay, and this is an innate need for the child, essentially, to show off and be seen for who it is. As we said before, he doesn't have an explanation for where this comes from. We'll try and give you an archetypal explanation because we think this is correct. We think he's right about this, but it's grounded archetypally. Archetypally means transpersonally. What he says has to happen is that this in the child has to be mirrored. And what he means by mirrored is that, to give an example, a little girl runs in and wearing her new dress and says, "Look at me, aren't I pretty?" And she's joyful and happy and full of herself. And the correct mirroring response to that is for the mirroring person to say, "Yes, darling, you're gorgeous, you're pretty," and share the child's joy and reflect it back to her. Okay? That's what's known by... Now, there are a million examples. That's a gross example. It begins right in infancy, when the infant looks at the mother and sees something which reflects its own inner sense of joy back to it. And this experience of being mirrored occurs at all developmental stages. So the old oral, anal, genital, phallic stuff that we all were force-fed when we were growing up, all that stuff is subsumed in this way. For instance, the kid goes to the potty training, goes to the toilet, have a bowel movement. The mirroring response is, "Oh boy, that's wonderful, you got it in the potty and not in your diaper." Okay. So all these things can be, all these, what used to be called, where so much importance used to be attached, and now it's just subsumed under these general categories. Okay. So you mirror constantly. And what happens to this need is it just gets more mature. It never dies away. According to this theory, there's always a need for mirroring, because this thing in us that wants to be seen never really goes away. So, as I sit here now, if you look at me and nod occasionally, that's a mature mirror, okay? But the theory says that my need for that has never gone away fully, okay? It might be sublimated or neutralized, so that as I teach, it's really my archaic grandiosity appearing in this sublimated or neutralized form. I don't know if it's neutralized or sublimated. Is the original thing still obvious? But
the archaic become contemporary?
The idea is that archaic means infantile. This is very roughly speaking, and it should slowly mature, so that when you get to be an adult, if this has gone well, your needs are no longer archaic, so that you're not hungry for it, dying for it, and crushed if you don't get it, but that you still need it at a mature level. In other words, it would be unbearable to come in here and have everybody totally stony-faced. Okay, then it would be. So there's a need. Now, but when there's a defect arises when it wasn't met in childhood. So if there were gross or subtle failures, to the extent that this process was not met in childhood, that person will grow up relatively more or less mirror hungry for mirroring. And if it was grossly unmet, if there was nobody there to mirror back the child's joy and sense of self-importance, then the child, now an adult, will go around hungry for that and always needing applause, always needing patting on the back, always needing someone to tell them they're okay.
Does this infantile need include mirroring of unhappy or unacceptable or
yes. Let me talk. Thank you for mentioning. The theory says this: that the way first of all, the adult who's doing this for the child is called a self-object. That's one word, it's not hyphenated. And a self-object is unlike the old psychoanalytic word object meant another person on whom you would discharge or satisfy your drive, the object of the drive. The self-object is an object who is experienced by the child as carrying out a function like mirroring, but there are others, which the child cannot do for himself. Okay, so it is as if the other person is an extension of myself, to the extent that I need them to do something for me that I can't do for myself. It's like an arm or a leg where it's like a part of you that does something for you. Well, the self-object does that for you. You can't mirror yourself. Well, maybe you can. But
you can't as a baby. Because you have no reference point. You haven't developed a central point that you can use to reflect upon yourself. In the Jungian terms, you have no ego-self axis. You have no point from which you can stand and then reflect upon who you are.
Right, but in infancy, the child absolutely needs the self-object to do something that he cannot do for himself. Okay, so the adult, and it doesn't have to be, it can be any adult, mother, father, whoever's around. So the mirroring self-object is carrying out this essential function. Now, the way the self-object does this is through a process of tuning in to the child. Okay, and it tunes into the self-object tunes into the child's affect, to the child's feelings. be they happy or sad or whatever they are, through this process that is called empathy. Okay? So a good self-object is an empathic self-object, and that means that their resonance emotionally with the child is good. That you have a sense of what's going on in the kid, and you respond in a way that resonates just with that. So if the kid's upset, the resonance will be, oh, you poor thing, what can I do to help, or whatever it is. It doesn't matter what the affect is, it's the resonance that's important. And so that a good self-object is an empathically attuned self-object. And an unempathic self-object misses the point. The example that comes to mind from Kohut is that the kid who comes home from school excited about some school project, going like this, and instead of the mother picking up the excitement about the school project, she says, "Don't talk with your hands." And you see the empathic miss, where instead of tuning into the child's joy and excitement, she responds to just a part of the child which corresponds to her own narcissistic need for order or whatever her shtick was, but it wasn't to tune into what the child needed. Okay.
And when this happens, if you can imagine that experience, the child is filled with tremendous shame, because it's full of excitement, it's full of itself.
It's full of archaic exhibitionistic energy.
And to have that not met, to have that dampened down, pushed away, it's then filled with shame. So you'll see people who have problems in this area, just tremendous shame about their own feelings and thoughts and
needs to be
excitement. And
you can't stand being excited. Can't stand being called on in class, being asked to stand up and talk or something, because it fills them with this kind of exhibitionistic energies which were forbidden in childhood and which are associated with shame. So it's one of the causes of shyness. It's not the only cause, it's one of the causes of shyness. Okay. You see how that would happen if that was always crushed. So that's the notion of the mirroring self-object. And now the theory says that when let's say the child is in some emotional state and the mother tunes in and there's this resonance, then the child's internal state is mirrored, reflected, confirmed by the mother or father. And the theory says that then a piece of the self is formed in the child, because that experience is, so to speak, taken into the child. It's as if what the kid puts out is received, mirrored, and then the kid can take it back and say, ah, yes, that happened, and that's a piece of me. Okay, and that is called, in Kohut, transmuting internalization, which is a ridiculous term. I don't know how it came. Transmuting internalization. And Kohut says that when you eat hamburger, you don't turn into a cow, you turn into you. Okay, and that these self-object needs are analogously, the self-object need is like a nutrient. It's like a psychological equivalent of a nutrient, like a piece of protein, which you make yourself out of. You get the idea. When you have one of these experiences, it's as if your body had eaten something it needed to make some of you, so that is used to make some of you. So the outer experience is internalized, and a piece of self-structure is made.
It's transmuted in that it's not taken in whole. It's not interjected as this whole piece that you identify with. It's changed. It's made a part of you, as opposed to just being a solid piece of mother that you
in other words, it's not a gross identification where you just copy.
Which is, I think, one of the places where Kohut really added something and described the process a little differently.
Is this clear so far? Is it clear how this is different from identification?
Historically, the term transmuting internalization has a precedent in James Strachey's use of the notion of transmuting interpretation. So
which will cause change. Yeah, thank you. Right. So you see, that's just one tiny example of how the personal self is built up by accretion from an experience with another person. Is that not clear?
Well, I've always been a little unclear about the
meaning of the word, and I guess if you could give some kind of example.
Of which word?
Transmuting internalization.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's a great term.
One way to think about it is that this pole, what this leads to, if this develops as it should, is it leads to a sense of healthy ambition.
Yeah, I was going to come to that. Maybe I could just go on with my...
Because one way to think of it is that, let's say your father was a doctor, you wouldn't decide to be a doctor, which would be an identification, but you would internalize the sense that one could be what one wants to, one can be something powerful, but you would change it. It would be different inside of you than it is inside of him. It would have its own character. It would become a part of your life. So
it's not just a plain identification, it's like a personalization.
That's why he calls it transmuting, because it changes as it comes in. So that your dad's ambitious, you're ambitious, but his ambition goes into medicine, yours goes into the piano. What you get, you see the point.
It's like metabolism. When you eat something, it's broken down into the basic proteins and then rebuilt into your own cells.
That's what he's trying to say. You see the difference between that and just identification. Okay. So what he says is that this is eventually, as Cathy says, will become healthy ambition and healthy normal self-esteem. Because you have innumerable experiences, let's say, of empathic, accurate mirroring, and that will lead to a sense of, if this joy and goodness I feel inside me is being mirrored and met and reflected back, then I must be really worth something. I must be really okay. You can see how if that happens to the kid enough, they would grow up with healthy self-esteem and ambition, in the sense that I am somebody valuable. And how if that goes wrong,
How is that different then from the Winnicottian idea of good enough mothering resulting in feeling good enough? I mean, in terms of these internalizations, I guess I still don't see here how self-psychology differs from object relations.
Oh, well, just ask 4 questions. It differs from logic. You want to do that?
Well, I'll do the first part in terms of Winnicott's good enough mothering. Yeah, you can do the second part. Anything where it says object relations, you can do that part. I think that Winnicott, this is a part of good enough mothering. And that good enough mothering is a broad term that includes not only mirroring but also idealization, which we'll talk about next. And many people feel that Kohut should have credited Winnicott in the development of his ideas, which he doesn't do. But there are many, many similarities. Winnicott's notion of the transitional space, the transitional object, if you look at that, is very similar to the idea of a self-object. In that when we talk about a self-object, we're in this kind of gray area where it is another person out there, but the child isn't experiencing that person as another person. They're experiencing that person as if she's an appendage, as if she's part of an extension. And Kohutians are very strong on reminding us all that they're an intrapsychic theory. It's an intrapsychic theory, not interpersonal, and that it's really the child's, they wouldn't like the word fantasy, but the child's experience of the other that is what's important.
That's a terribly important point. See, it's not exactly outer, because you're not really an extension of me. But if I experience you intrapsychically as an extension of me, then we're into Winnicott. It's not fully inner, it's not fully outer. You see how the similarity is. And of course in Jung we call that the imaginatio. Okay? And that takes us into the whole realm of religion and the importance of the imaginal and Corbett, and links this, not that Kohut knew any of this, but it links the whole tradition of the importance of the imagination which is a realm. It's hard to say where, it's in quotes, where the imagination is. It links this with William Blake.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, we think the imaginatio is terribly important. We think that's where the whole of shamanism occurs. And we think that's a very real, we don't know what to call it, because it's not really a place, you see. It doesn't have spatial reality, but it's extremely important and real. Anyway, the self-object experience is wherever that is, that's where it is. It's not exactly outer, it's not exactly inner.
What anthropologists call the liminal.
No, it's not the liminal. When they talk about liminal, well, as I understand liminal, they're talking about the individual developmentally being the threshold between two developmental points. Oh, I see what you mean. Intrapsychically.
That's another discussion, perhaps.
Yeah.
But that's where ritual and religion often occurs.
I see what you're saying. I'm sorry. I apologize. You're right. In sacred time and space. We talk, yes. Of course, the imaginatio is very similar to sacred time and space, a la Iliade and everybody else. And certainly that's where ritual occurs. And that certainly is liminal. Yeah. If we get off onto that, we'll be here for a week.
We can go into the class next door. The
second point was, just briefly, the reason this is not an object relations theory is that object relations theory is still essentially drive theory. Okay, where the object is used, certainly in classical theory to discharge a drive, and then in the British object relations theory where the drive, relationship seeking is the drive, yeah. But to cut a long story short, in self-psychology, the drives are only seen when the self is falling apart. And if the self is well put together, you don't see the drives. And I'm going to overstate it slightly. For the self-psychologist, all that drive stuff is all the result of the self fragmenting.
Failures in empathy.
Failures.
So if the unfolding needs are met, then there's no drive.
You don't see drive. If you said something to me grossly unempathic and I got in a rage, there you'd see my drive. But that's because my self fell apart because of your lack, because you failed me as a mirroring self-object. But if you were accurate and empathic and made me feel okay, you wouldn't see that drive. So you only see the drive. So they've just included all that drive stuff. Which has enraged everybody.
If she wasn't empathic and you, however, were mirrored properly, you would need to rage, right?
Well, you see, I wouldn't need to get... It depends how well put together I am.
Well, that's what I mean.
Let me answer that now. That's a very important point. To the extent that this process fails, there are lacunae in the structure of the self. The self, instead of being a piece of cheese, is a piece of Swiss cheese, with bigger or smaller holes. And every time there's an empathic failure from the parent, not just one, you don't have to worry about getting it right every time, but repeatedly, okay? Well, I've got to talk about traumatic versus assimilable, optimal, should we do that now or later? Anyway, to the extent that there's repeated traumatic failures, okay, the self forms with a hole in it, with a defect in it, okay? And so a self that has a lot of these defects in it, because mirroring, let's say, was so bad, is a fragile self. And that's the restoring that Kohut talks about in the second book, the restoration, that the therapy fills in those holes. And we'll talk about how the transference fills those in, okay? But is that clear? So if myself was a piece of Swiss cheese, and every time I said something, it felt like, this is so important for you to agree with me, because I'm really on the line here, and you disagree with me, and you said, no, that's wrong, then if I fell apart, then you'd see this narcissistic rage. That would mean, diagnostically, that I had a very fragilely put together self, and that I always feel on the line when my opinion is being doubted, you see. Okay? But if I was well put together, and you could just disagree with me, and I wouldn't feel it was any skin off my nose, and it would be okay, because I was well enough put together, then I wouldn't fragment, and I wouldn't get in a rage. Okay? So there's a difference between narcissistic rage and primary rage.
Are you saying there's a difference between Winnicott and Kohut in the way they view it as an intrapsychic experience? I kind of got lost in that.
Winnicott and Kohut are similar in that they both view it as an intrapsychic experience. Yes, that's a place where they're similar.
Kohut filled out Winnicott. Well, Winnicott says good enough mothering, that's sure, but what does that mean? And Kohut, we think, is just giving some examples of what there is. This is just one of them.
One thing to add, and you started to get into it a little bit, the traumatic versus assimilable failures, is that in this process of the kind of refining and maturing of this archaic grandiosity, there are places where the parent is going to fail, or it's going to be experienced as failure. If the child's terribly excited and starts to dart out across the street in front of a car, and the parent, screams at it to stop, that might be experienced by the child as some sort of failure or squashing or whatever, but it was necessary. And many of the Kohutians believe that it's actually in the failures that inner structure is born, that it's in the tiny little failures in mirroring that one then has to take on that task oneself. And this is what you'll see often in therapy, in the process of therapy, which we'll get into later.
But the failure must not be traumatic.
The failure has to be manageable, and it has to take place within the context of success, so that the child generally feels mirrored, knows what that is, can depend on the parent to do that, so that when the parent inevitably fails in these small ways, the child isn't totally traumatized, and the child can, in a sense, do that for itself, begin to develop the capacity to do that for itself.
Oh, well, if you won't look at my homework, I guess I'll have to realize it's okay myself.
I'll put it on the refrigerator, I'll put it on the bulletin board.
There's a piece of structure built based on an assimilable, what he calls optimal disillusionment. Optimal meaning
frustration.
Optimal frustration, or disillusionment, really. But it's manageable by the kid. It doesn't cause damage. That's distinct from these examples I gave, like the don't talk with your hands, which is crushing, which is unmanageable, and that causes damage. The first one causes growth. The second, the traumatic one, causes pathology. And in the transference, which we'll talk about, you get the same thing. You get empathic failures that are manageable and structure building. You get empathy, which is also structure building when it's accurate, and you can repeat severe traumata in the transference too, but you can also heal structural damage in the transference by being empathically correct in an individual who, when they were a child, was massively traumatized, if you don't manage to repeat the same thing, which one is always tempted to do, of course. The nature of the transference being what it is. We'll talk about that. Should we
can we take a break before we do idealization?
Can we take a real 10-minute break? We'll get there before the show ends.
A couple of things that came up during the break, the fact that we have people from such varied backgrounds here and tremendously different in terms of exposure to these ideas. I think we'll keep trying to talk sort of in the middle line of it all. And I think for people who this is real new, that the initial hurdle is the language and just, the way the words are used and what the words mean. And I think that we'll go over and over and over that because we'll keep using these words. So just ask. If we use a word or a concept that just, doesn't make any sense, be sure to ask. I'm sure you won't be alone.
You want to do the other?
Yeah.
And then we have to do the examples.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Yeah, you have to have examples.
Okay. We'll start back with these two poles. The next pole that Kohut talks about is the pole of idealization. It's kind of an odd word for this. He also talks about the ideal parental imago. And this is a line of development that he sees as paralleling this line of development of archaic grandiosity. And what he's referring to here is the need in a baby, if you imagine yourself a small baby, to have the sense of there being someone there or something there that's larger and stronger and knows what's going on and can calm it and soothe it and organize it and feed it and do those kind of overarching functions that the baby can't do for itself. And Kohut calls this idealization, that process is where the child is able to view the parent in this idealizing way. The child is able to look up to the parent and see in the parent this capacity. He also describes it as the capacity of the parent to be imbued with certain values and ideals and goals, and the child is able to see the parent as a kind of carrier of meaning and purpose and goals and values.
Can I just interject? So there's a pair of opposites here which gets important when we talk about Jung. Here the kid feels all the goodness and wonderfulness is inside me. And here the kid feels all the wonderfulness is he's got it.
It's out there.
It's out there.
And you'll see this talked about in Jung in terms of projection of the self onto someone else. And you see that process often in therapy where the patient needs to project, to put that goodness and strength and power and knowledge onto the therapist. And the theory is that if the parent allows the child to do this, then slowly the child is able to internalize that sense of order and organization and meaning and value, is able to have that inside itself and carry that for itself. To the extent that that doesn't happen, what that will often look like down here is one way in which it's seen is in people who have no ability to soothe themselves, to calm themselves down, to order their own affects, and they get flooded with these strong affects, which will often lead into things like alcohol or substance abuse, because the person needs something out there to calm itself down. It's almost like the person idealizes the drug, idealizes the substance and sees it as the thing on which it can depend. It's the object that's always there and that won't ever let it down. Right. And soothing and independent.
And also the capacity to deal with impulses.
When you think about a little baby the fantasy is, and when you watch little babies, that they are filled with intense feelings and needs and physiological kinds of experiences it has no way of understanding or responding to, and that it needs to know that there's someone out there who will feed it, will soothe it, will help it organize itself, will teach it. Now, when this develops in a healthy way, the kind of sublimated form of this is that sense of, if you've ever had a teacher or someone whom you admired, and being around them made you feel better, made you feel like you. A good teacher is an object, is a person who can be idealized, who will allow themselves to be idealized, and will then impart to you the fact that you can learn, make you feel that you can learn, that you can be as good as he is. And this is that process when you look at the parent and the child, of the child beginning to take in some of the parental functions and the parental values. You also see people who end up kind of aimless and have no internal sense of goal or purpose, kind of emptiness inside where there's no meaning. That's sort of the other direction that this can take when it isn't handled in an optimal way.
So we should give an example. The kid comes home and says to father, I just told all my friends that you were the greatest father on the block. There's the idealization. Okay. Now the good idealizing self-object father, even though he knows he might not be what the kid is assuming him to be, will just nod, smile, and sort of go along with it. Whereas the poor self-object father will say, oh shucks, and be embarrassed and not accept the idealization. Okay, and that's how it can, one of the ways it can fail. Okay. And of course this gets repeated in therapy all the time, but we'll talk about that later. So any questions about idealizing?
Is there any sense in Kohut that in their unhealthy manifestations of these two poles, idealization and grandiosity, that one is in a way worse than the other? I mean, to me it sounds as though grandiosity might be more precarious a state than idealization, because at least you've got something out there that you can attach to.
Grandiosity might be...
Where grandiosity would be like inflation. There's nothing that you're really attached to. You're sort of the center of things.
I don't know if I understand. But when you have a failure of the idealizing pole, then you're very drifty and very aimless. You don't have goals and values. When you have a failure of this pole, you're bursting with your own self-importance. I guess it depends which you prefer.
Yeah, well, one thing, I mean, we were talking about failures, and this pole is leading to shyness and, but it can also lead to exhibitionism and kind of frantic attempts to get that grandiosity mirrored, and yet underneath that grandiosity is very poor self-esteem. And I guess the place where that ties in with Jungian theory is when Jungians use the word inflated. It's when someone is identified with that archaic grandiosity.
We'll link that up more when we talk about Jung's concept.
Kohut doesn't distinguish between any failures in either of these leading to more pathological problems.
Which is more pathological?
Yeah, he sees them as these two separate poles that are going along and are of equal importance. He talks about the fact that if you have failures here, he'll describe patients that had terrible failures in this pole, and that a particular period in their life they kind of realized that, and they moved over to this pole and compensated, so that their personality then becomes more formed around this pole of development, and maybe their parent is not as bad at being idealized as at mirroring.
So a self-object can be very good at one, but not at the other. So like, let's say you have a kid who's getting very good mirroring until the Oedipal period from the mother. But because of the mother's own difficulty, she can't mirror. Well, the whole Oedipal thing takes on a whole different light in this theory, but we'll do it sometime. But she can't mirror him adequately during the Oedipal transit.
Because of maybe her problems with sexuality.
Because of her own difficulties. But there's a brilliant academic father in the family, and the kid realizes that he can look up to his father, and fortunately he's bright himself. So he gets onto this idealizing a father, and I'm going to be a lawyer or whatever it is, just like Daddy. And he idealizes his father, so he moves, because that stops for him because the mother won't carry it anymore. So he moves over to the other pole, becomes a brilliant scholar, and that develops what we call, or Kohut calls, a compensatory structure, where, let's say, his great scholarship is a compensatory structure for a defect in early mirroring. Okay. Well, that's just one example, but
and yet it seems for health they need each other. They need to be in isolation. Because if you say to the boy, when he says to the father, you're the greatest, Dad, and you accept it, then that means that he's the luckiest. Or
sure, because I'm a part of that.
Right.
That's when you idealize someone, you really want to be a part of them, and if you can't get to them, it causes all kinds of problems. If you look at Freud, see, this self-development scheme in Kohut is what it was initially called narcissistic development, which really means the development of the self. And so narcissism in this language has to do with the development of a personal self. It's no longer pathological. See, in Freud there was a YouTube theory, and Freud said if you took object love of another person, okay, and narcissism, love of yourself, stop me if I say something that's incomprehensible. When one goes up, the other goes down. So that to the extent that you're not involved in yourself, you can love another person. And to the extent that you are engrossed in yourself, you're not loving the other person. Okay? So this is object love and hate, and this is narcissism and all that. Kohut comes along and says, no, these two things are totally different lines of development, and object love and hate and all that Oedipal stuff that we were all brought up on is going on, and this narcissistic self-development is going on, and they're not the same thing. Okay, they intertwine, but they are not the same thing. A radical departure from Freud. Okay, but any Jungian would just shrug at that. That's obvious. But that was a radical departure.
Does the whole Oedipal thing become, in a sense, subordinate to the
I mean, just briefly, the problem with the Oedipal transit, because I don't know if we'll ever have time to cover this, is not the child's drive towards the opposite sex parent, but how that parent receives them, whether they can be joyfully received, mirrored, and whatnot, and whether the sexuality, which is a reflection of the child's good feelings about who he is and whatnot, how that's mirrored and received, and whether, say if it's a boy, whether the father can be really idealized at that time. And those are the critical things, not the raw drive. It's not just that you want to screw your mother. What you want is to be seen, all that good stuff to be seen. Okay, and if that works properly, then you know how the superego is formed based on the Oedipal transit. Yeah, am I talking Greek? If that works properly, then the superego, contents of the superego are idealized. Okay. Well, it's kind of a long story to go into, but he's made the Oedipal period just another phase in which these processes have to be properly handled. You see.
And like in the side of aggression, Kohut talks about the fact that what's happening in this Oedipal period is an emerging of the child's healthy assertiveness, and it's coming from that developed sense of self, and that if that is not mirrored properly or accepted or channeled by an idealized parent, that turns into aggression, that can break down into aggression, and that the so-called sexuality is really just the child's love and joy and attraction towards...
At that particular developmental period, that's how it just expresses itself. Yeah.
In other words, then the conflicts at the Oedipal level really reflect these more fundamental. And there is no such thing really as an Oedipal conflict.
Although it might be that it's at that stage that these break, that your parents can't do it.
Because the parent can't handle the kid's energy, the kid's sexual energy coming at them. If they can't handle it, then there's a failure. But it's a failure at the Oedipal stage. But it can be a failure at the toilet training stage or at some other stage earlier on. It's just that some parents can handle it till a certain thing happens and then it falls apart. Depends where the parent's problem is.
One other thing, just by way of qualification, you were talking about compensation before as a function of some kind, and I'm wondering whether, to what extent that that exists between grandiosity and idealization. I mean, you use the ego.
Yeah, well, we were trying to give an example of that.
Right. But I'm still not entirely clear. Does more of one mean less of the other?
It shouldn't. No, this is not a you. This is two separate lines of development. No, it's an interesting idea, the effect of compensation. You think about it in Jungian terms, because you can look upon these as, Lionel already mentioned this, as a pair of opposites. Here all the goodness is in you, here all the goodness is on someone else. Now, are those really opposites, or are those complementary? And Jung was very big on these pairs of opposites, and
but we're a little worried about that.
Yeah.
So let's gloss over that. Well, there's a middle. If you want to call it a pole, Kohut talks about a bridging. What's the exact phrase?
Arc.
The arc which links these two. And this is the child's innate talents and abilities. So it forms a sort of third factor. Okay, innate talents and abilities. So the way that works would be, for instance, suppose that if this works properly, if this side works properly, you have ambition. If this side works properly, you know exactly what you're going to do with your ambition. But you have to have talents and abilities to bridge that. So what I mean is, suppose you're born with the talents and abilities to become a concert pianist. Okay, that's this middle pole of innate talents and abilities. Let's just use that as an example. If your archaic grandiosity is mirrored properly, then you'll have the ambition that will push you into everything that you need to do that. So you've got the ambition, you've got the talents, but if there's a failure of idealization, you'll never have any sense of goal and what to do with your talents and your ambition, and you'll just drift. On the other hand, if you've got the goal, and you know you want to become a concert pianist, and you know that you've got the talents because you're born with it, but this pole fails, you don't have enough ambition, then you won't have enough push. So for it all to work properly, it's your ambition, your talents will be pushed by your ambition into a particular goal. You see how it fits together. But you've got to be reasonably together. And obviously, if you don't have the talents, then you can have all the ambition and all the goals in the world. It won't work if you haven't got the talents. So you have to. That's how they bridge the two. You see, is that clear? And in therapy, this leads to a third kind of transference. This leads to a mirror transference, an idealizing transference, and this leads to what's called a twinship transference. We'll talk more about those. Where you want the therapist to be the same as you. Okay. So that's kind of a lot. Are there any questions?
About why Kohut would assume ambition is a natural outcome of mirroring. That is, why, if one has been satisfied and there's a balance, need there be any ambition? And as a correlate, many people who have made a mark in the world were obviously filled by compensatory needs.
Oh yeah. Well, a lot of people who are tremendously ambitious are doing it as a compensation, or as a defense against a feeling of inferiority, or to cope with a feeling of inadequacy or something. But you see, it has a very different quality. When you talk to somebody who's just naturally talented, and they just do what they do and they're good at it, that is very different than somebody who's kind of hungry for your approval, even though they might also be naturally talented.
But to do what one does well doesn't mean, in fact rarely it might mean a drive to excel.
Yeah. I think ambition might have been an unfortunate choice of words. He chose that, and he qualifies it by talking about healthy ambition. But self-esteem might be a better word for it. And the sense that one can accomplish.
It's competence.
Competence, yeah.
Which considers this a very different mentation.
Maybe it's a bad word.
Yeah, she just mentioned the sense of joyfulness in one's accomplishment
rather than ambition.
The multi-side life would be a perfect example of the combination of all these things, wouldn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, he's got a lot of talent. Yeah. Who did he idealize?
He has a talent.
Yeah.
Well,
Who did he idealize?
His father, I think.
He idealized his father.
Well, he struggled to idealize his father.
Yeah.
To maintain it.
Yeah.
Well, you see the defects.
But his father was very supportive.
Oh no, he was very narcissistic, and he was bringing his son all around and putting him on pianos and.
Really?
I'm not sure he was supportive. I think he used.
I didn't get the feelings that the father was not supportive of Mozart's letters.
I don't know enough about it. We're into psychohistory now, which is a field that's full with problems.
In what way was his father not supportive?
Well, it's a whole story. We could talk about it.
Let's talk about it afterwards.
I think one way to look at this is that Kohut also talks about phase-appropriate mirroring and phase-appropriate idealization, meaning that there are certain types and qualities and ways of mirroring that are appropriate at different stages of development, and that it's not appropriate to push maybe a 2-year-old into ballet lessons and say, you know, you're great, you're the world's greatest dancer or whatever. That might be more appropriate as the child has developed and is showing some evidence of talent. If it's fake or phony or coming out of their own need to have the most brilliant child or the most talented child, then it's not appropriate to the place where the child is.
Let me get into Alice Miller, where the parents using the child for their own needs.
There's also the idea that this archaic grandiosity has to be tempered and matured and refined and
through failures.
Through failures.
Appropriate failures. You're not that great, and you may think you're wonderful, but occasionally you discover unpleasantly that you're not that wonderful. Well, those are, if they're phase appropriate and tolerable.
And being and doing have to be distinguished then. One can fail in efforts but still be okay.
You know, something makes us go to school and spend 25 years getting hundreds of degrees. I mean, and something on this side, whatever you want to call it. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. We'd sit at home and just reflect on the nature of things. So something moves us to get out there and do it, and that's what he's talking about. Ambition may not be the right word, but it's that inner push to
express oneself.
Maybe that's it. Maybe that's it. Yeah, you got the idea.
Part of that's very Winnicottian too, isn't there?
What's that?
That's also sort of Winnicottian, part of that idea, in that there are certain kinds of failures that are very important.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Environment.
Yeah.
So good enough, good environment, holding environment.
The child has to be hated in order to love, that sort of thing.
Okay, well let's try and stay in. We're already mixing two things. We'll try not to. What should we do now? I guess we should talk about
Jung's Jung's self.
Concept of the self.
Unless I don't know if you want to go directly into those.
Well, I could start from at the back end. And,
since we're talking about this.
All right. See, for Jung, the self is not built by accretion. We're talking about now the self with the big S. The self is just a priori, it's just there. And if you start to ask, well, how does it just get there? You know, at what point during the pregnancy is it given? It's like a sort of theological argument. We don't know, when does the soul come in and all that. Well, these are imponderable questions because we don't know
what it is.
What it is. Thank you. We don't know what the self is. We think it includes the body and the genes, but we don't think it's limited to that. But we think, because we think that Jung's self includes spirit, and we don't think that spirit is reducible to the body. Okay. So the answer about where Jung's self comes from is we don't know. And it's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's like the ontological ground of this of Jungian thought. It's like you have to. This is where I stand, and I don't know where this comes from, but it's a God term. We can't say where it comes from. But for the Kohutians, the self-object is a God term, and these two poles are a God term. They can't say where they come from either. So the notion that when somebody starts something, you have to allow them one miracle. Just the point being, you have to start somewhere, you see. If you don't let someone start somewhere, if you make them prove where they start, then they never get started. So we don't know what the self is any more than we know what God is in any sense that means anything. So it's an a priori concept, which is where everything begins in Jungian psychology. So the self for Jung is just there when you are born. And in Jung's notion, the self unfolds, and we call that individuation. Okay, and individuation is mentioned in Kohut actually, because Kohut says that there is a blueprint in the child, and that the little s self, now Kohut self, is unfolding according to this innate blueprint, which was present at birth. Now they might say the blueprint's in the genes. Okay. And we would quarrel with that. But blueprint in quotes theories, are problematic theories, you see, because if you're going to say there's a blueprint, you have to say, where does the blueprint come from? And then you're immediately philosophically in deep water, because you have to postulate something that's more complicated than the blueprint that designed the blueprint. And you're in an infinite regress problem, which takes you back to the Big Bang. So these blueprint theories, which Kohut and Jung both talk about, essentially, are very problematic philosophically. Just saying there's a blueprint doesn't say anything in terms of... So we don't know about origins, we don't have a good origin myth. But they both talk about... Well, Kohut talks about a blueprint, and Jung talks about individuation as the unfolding of the self. So there's that area of similarity. This is incredibly important from a religious point of view, you see, because if the self, one of the meanings of the self is the imago Dei, the inner image of God in the child, then it means that is directing the evolution of the child's psyche. See, well, the implications of that for spiritual development are very important, and the intermingling there, but that's really the subject of another talk, except to say that in Jung, Jung postulates the existence of what he calls archetypes. Now, it's very important to understand what an archetype is and what the self is. Any archetype in Jung is a component of the self. There isn't such a thing as the self. And I'm not going to get struck by lightning, because you mustn't think of Jung's self as if it was an orange in the head, like a monotheistic sort of, there is a self and it's one blob somewhere. Okay, the self manifests itself in different ways, and what we call the archetypes, or what Jung calls the archetypes, are just manifestations of the self, and the self has many manifestations. So in this sense, it's sort of polytheistic. The self, or the image of the divine in the individual, can manifest itself in any of several different ways. But when it does that, we call them archetypes. But there's no essential difference between the transpersonal self and the archetypes. Is that clear? They're just manifestations.
The archetype is a pattern of manifestation, right. And it's transpersonal in that it's common patterns that we all experience. They're filled out. They're colored differently for each of us. They have different pictures in them, different images in them, but the pattern is the same.
So the archetypes or the self are what we call morphogenetic principles. In other words, they determine structure. Okay. If you want to know why you're an artist and not an accountant, or a lawyer and not a ballet dancer, we would say, well, assuming your development didn't get distorted, which of course is another story, but assuming that you unfolded the way you were supposed to, that there is a form-determining principle that moves through you. There is something in you present at birth which structures your psyche and your body in a particular way and not in another way. Okay. This is un-American, because people like the idea that they can do anyone can do anything. Well, in this theory, anyone can't do anything. The best thing you can do is find out who you are. And even that's not true. The best thing you can do is find out what you are, because there is an objective or archetypal dimension to the individual which is given. It's like, this is what you are, and it's going to unfold, and you are this and you're not that. And that morphogenetic, that structure-giving notion is the archetype. And it's just an inherent, innate, and it's very important when you talk about archetypes to realize that these are natural laws, just like the laws of gravity. And people always say to us, the Jungians, well, where are these archetypes? Are they in the brain or the genes? Well, where is the law of gravity? Where is the law of gravity? I mean, think about that. Apples fall from trees. Well, where is the law which says that? Well, that's a ridiculous question. Okay? The laws are not embodied. Laws are not in a particular place. That's how the universe is put together. Well, the archetypes are natural laws. They aren't in any particular place. They aren't in the brain or in the kidneys. They're like gravity. That's just the way things are.
They're predictive.
Yeah.
They allow you to predict.
And we don't know what they are. We don't know what the law of gravity is in the metaphysical sense. We know its manifestations, but we don't know what it is in its essence, in some Platonic sense. Okay. So hence the notion of archetype. It's a structure-giving principle, and you can't really say what it is, only how it manifests itself, what its effects are. So anything that gives structure and form to the psyche is archetypal by definition. Okay. So there is a mother archetype, a father archetype, a priest archetype, whatever it is. Okay. You are structured that way. Okay. And it's given. And you can see immediately why Jung is criticized for being religious and romantic, both of which are true, but some of us happen to like that. But well, you see, if this is true, then these that we've talked about in Kohut are archetypal, because they are form determining, they are structure determining. Okay, you see what I mean by that? These are structural determinants within the child's psyche. So we would say that Kohut stumbled on the personalistic manifestations of two archetypes. Okay? But I'll break that down a bit for you. But
actually, three, if you think of the talents and skills.
Actually, okay. But he's describing in personalistic terms what is an inherent, innate, or archetypal dimension within the child. Okay. So then, what is that? So Corbett is saying, well, there is in the child something which feels wonderful and joyful. Okay. Now, the self, the transpersonal self, we think, this is an adultomorphism, but we think that when the baby is in touch with that it experiences joy. You could say, from a religious point of view, that it's with God. Okay? But whether you call it God or the self is just a linguistic problem. Neither of them have a whole lot of... they're just a reference to something that is not understandable. But the child is in touch with something very numinous. Okay? So when the child is expressing its joy at being in touch with this, okay, that is the inner experience of the transpersonal self. Okay? And that's where that fullness and joy, and what here is called archaic grandiosity and exhibitionism, that's what that's expressing. Now, and here's the relationship between God and man mediated by the parent. If the parent can see that joy in the child and reflect it back, then a piece of it will incarnate. In other words, you see what I mean by that, come into the body as behavior, as lived experience, not just as potential. Is this making any sense, or is this Greek? Okay, so...
It would be like a transmuting...
That's how it happens. But that is how the archetype incarnates.
Yeah, that's how it would.
Okay, you see how we're going to link up. So we're going to say that this theory is a theory of incarnation. That the transpersonal self, the bigger self, is there at birth, but it only exists as potential. It's like Rives is born as a newborn baby and he can't play the piano yet, but all that talent is there as potential. How does it incarnate? How does it get into the body as behavior? Okay? How does it become a person? Well, we're talking about the incarnation of this transpersonal potential. Does that make sense? And we're saying that it has to be seen by the mother. Later we'll talk about the importance of soul here. and reflect it back. And when that happens and a piece of the kid's self is formed, as we described, that's a little piece of incarnation of what was a transpersonal potential. Does that make sense?
The problem comes in if the parent is not able to see this, if it just doesn't see it, if it sees it and is envious of it.
Oh, envy is a big one. Yes.
If it sees it and is frightened of it.
Frightened by it.
If it sees it and wants to have power over that, wants to control that, claim it for its own. So it's
parent sees
the child's joy.
The child's joy, the child's experience of God.
We're trying to explain where the joy comes from.
Yeah. So it's not just that the parent has to see it, and this is where Kohut kind of gets sort of general. He talks about, well, the parent has to see it and mirror it, but it has to be mirrored in particular ways, and if it's mirrored in these more negative ways, if it's seen and judged.
Then you get into the dark side of the self, or the dark side of God, which for us, from our psychological point of view, is no problem. We have a whole theory now about how that happens. If you're a theologian, you have all other problems, but from this point of view, we can talk about the dark side of the self or the dark side of God, and we can explain how that incarnates based on the parent's behavior. Okay, but that's the subject of another. But we think that here there is an archetypal basis to this. Okay, and there is an archetype that Jung talks about, which is called the divine child. Okay? And of course, the archetype of the divine child is, in mythology, is the story of Jesus, Hermes, Krishna, any of those types who are, as children, are obviously different, special, important. So they are helpless at the moment when they are born, but they have this incredible importance and potential. And we think that every child is born with the divine child as an innate possibility within them, and that potential has to be realized. So we're talking here, we think archetypally about the divine child, which is full of wondrous potential for the future, but still has to struggle with the world and is helpless and is highly likely to get crucified or something. Now there is another source of grandiosity, which is a little different than that. That knowing that there's a divine child in me and that I have a potential which is still unfolding and all that will lead me to behave in a certain way and will give me contact with joy and so on. But there is another kind of grandiosity which has to do with the fact that when the child is born, it is in a sense merged with the self, with the transpersonal self. You could say it's born out of God. Okay, or you could say that there is this totality experience, and the child feels part of the totality because it doesn't yet have a sense of I, because that hasn't yet differentiated in the little baby. So because it doesn't have a sense of I, it is part of this great ocean of consciousness, not differentiated. Does that make any sense? Now, when it's with its mother, and it feels the strength of its mother, okay, and it feels part of mother, it can feel powerful as a sort of vicarious power, okay, because it feels part of this larger totality. Well, some people never get out of that merger with the totality. They never get out of that kind of fusion experience with the totality, and they still have this extraordinary grandiosity, where it's as if they are not just the small eye, the crest of the wave, but the whole ocean. Okay, does that make any sense? That's a different kind of grandiosity, but it's due to a failure to fully emerge out of the unconscious.
Okay. Which could result from failures in mirroring.
Which could result from failures in mirroring.
If the mother is unable to see the child as separate. And mirror back its separateness. And sometimes mirroring back the separateness might be felt as painful and by the child, but it's necessary.
Yeah, this is, in another language, the birth of the ego. It doesn't matter what language you use. But if that differentiation out of the totality doesn't occur, then there's often an inflation where the person feels very grandiose and very self-important.
So in this case, the mother fuses with the child, and the child
is fused with the mother, and the child never fully separates out. In other words, the child grows up in some parts of their psyche still fused with the power of the early experience with the mother.
But is there some action on the mother's part that causes?
Oh yeah, the mother won't let the kids separate because she needs the mother for her own self-integrity.
Yes.
So she won't let the kids separate. So she keeps the child in her own orbit and won't let it separate. Okay. Does that make sense?
Could you give another example of how that would manifest in, say, an adult or an adolescent?
I would think about people who expect themselves to be able to be successful at something without learning the basic steps, thinking you can just sit down at a piano and become a concert pianist, and that you don't need to do the scales over and over again, or
it's a narcissistic character disorder who's inflated and full of his own self-importance. I don't need what other people need, like he says, that kind of stuff. I can just do it. Have you ever? Can you play the violin? I don't know. I've never tried.
Could you give an example of how the mother could?
There are certain types of mothers where the self-object direction is reversed. It's called the reverse self-object experience, where the mother's so fragile that she can't bear the child to separate from her because she needs the child for her own integrity. Because without the child, she'll fall apart, so she has to sleep with the child all the time. Otherwise, she'll be anxious. Or she has to take the kid with her everywhere to keep her own anxiety down.
So the child's feeling of individualization is never
it's not allowed. The kid can't separate.
This result in this grandiosity, which
then the kid
down and play, thinking he can be a
the kid then is part of its mother, and Kohut gives a case of this actually, where the mother projected sort of messianic fantasies onto the child and said, "Oh, you're going to grow up and be so important and so wonderful, but you're doing it for me. But you're so wonderful, you're so important." And the kid grows up still fused with the mother, but full of this inflated self-importance that the mother stuffed it with. Okay. Then it's not a separate individual. It's living out its mother's life, not its own life, but it's full of all this important mother stuff. You see what I mean? That would be exactly.
It's difficult because maybe the child had to accept that role as a child. The mother would have fallen apart, so the child has to take on to itself. It can't divest itself of this grandiosity because it needs it in order to perform this function. Another example of the way it's seen, I was just thinking, is you'll see the opposite, but people who can't take compliments. Complimented, they then get in touch with that sense of grandiosity, and it's so strong in them because they've never separated from it that they can't, they're sort of hiding their light under a bushel because it's too stimulating and too overwhelming to feel their own grandiosity.
We want anyone to clap at the end of this.
If that happens, and a child could not accept compliments because it is stimulating that feeling, wouldn't that indicate that the child was trying to separate and that the mother simply would not permit it?
Well, we assume that they all try and separate. If you go into mythology, you see there are lots of son-lover myths where the mother goddess has a son-lover child, and it's a problem for the child to break away from the mother. That's the mythic background to this.
Well, would that child, I understand what you're saying, would that child still be impossibly inflated, so that it couldn't come down to earth if it was trying to separate?
Well, it's always trying to separate from the mother, but it cannot do it.
Would it retain that
It developmentally stops, yes, but the development stops, you see, and it can't differentiate itself. You see these mother-bound people. Mother still expects a phone call every day, and I'm still living. My mother wanted me to go to medical school, so here I am. I'm doing it for her. I might be miserable, but I'm living her life for her, whatever you want. I mean, it's that kind of stuff. Okay?
I don't see it so much as grandiosity, but more like dependence. Dependence issues.
Yeah, but isn't it both? Well, I think
the mother is living out her drives in the sun. I mean, maybe she wanted to be a doctor or whatever. The sun is in.
That can make the child feel very important.
Yeah.
If the child is needed by its mother, then the child begins to feel very, very important. And it might not even want to feel that important, but it's filled with that. And a lot of times that becomes split off. I'm thinking of a patient I have who was very important to her father, so important that her father came into her bed every night from like very early on till about 13. Now, she had to split that off and put it over here somewhere. So the first 3 or 4 years of therapy, it was, I'm this terrible person, I can't do anything, I can't accomplish anything, I have no importance in the world. But then slowly we found there was a little piece over here that felt like the most important person in the entire universe.
I suppose where I'm having a little bit of confusion is that originally you were saying there's a difference in this feeling of I'll say grandiosity from the way Kohut talks about it. There's a difference, and you said there's a different kind of
different quality. Yeah.
A different quality.
Well, it's a bad word. I understand.
And I have problems.
One is joy, and one is inflation. Is that any better? One is the joy of my expressing myself and allowing who I am to come through me. And the other is just I'm inflated for all this other sweetness that we... Is that any better?
That's a kind of self-importance.
Yeah, based on this kind of merger with Mother to me that we've been talking about. Is that any help? This grandiosity is a tricky word, but I'm trying to say that one, I think, is the joyful expression of the nature of myself, the self, coming through me. I just play the piano because that's what I am. Versus I'm doing it to make Mother happy so that she'll love me, so that I'll feel well, that's a whole different thing.
Just thinking, when Jung talks about inflation, isn't there a certain sense where there's an identification with an experience that if it were just something that came and went would be fine, but it takes on the whole. So rather than being filled with that sense of joy when that feeling comes and that sense of grandiosity when you're actually doing something terrific, you're terrific all the time. Whatever.
That's what we call identification with the archetype. Yeah.
The quality of joy as opposed to excessive grandiosity? Is there dimension of pleasure? Is one experienced as pleasure and the other is not? Is excessive grandiosity not experienced as a natural pleasure? Is it painful?
Excessive grandiosity is often defensive.
Yeah. And it's it's overstimulating.
Yeah.
It's being filled with something that's too much, and that was demanded of one. And it's been my experience that most people are uncomfortable with that and don't experience that as a source of joy, but as either a burden or
they're ashamed of it,
or an embarrassment.
You know, an image that comes to mind is Judy Garland. And she was one of these child stars whose mother pushed her constantly.
For her own needs, for the mother's needs.
Well, and I was thinking that because near the end of Judy Garland's life, I remember that last time in London, she kept, going up and then falling again in terms of the public. And one of her last performances, when she was on the Rives again in London, the audience began to applaud. And then the applause fell down. Judy Garland on the stage fell to her knees and said, "Keep applauding, keep applauding."
That's what we call mirror hungry. That's exactly mirror hungry. Okay, so desperate, because without it I'm falling apart.
So is there a lack of self-esteem?
Well, that's the point, that she's so mirror hungry because she didn't get it when she should have got it at an important developmental period. So now she's full of holes in that area, So she's hungry for it, to have it made up. And we'll talk about how that gets recreated in therapy and what the therapist should do in that kind of situation.
It seems hard to really grasp how deprived she could be, Judy Garland, or any of these. How about like opera singers? If you're doing this out of deprivation.
Well, I think there are people who do it because they have great innate talent, and there are people who are doing it who are desperate.
But it's hard to even, have any sense of how deprived that person can be. She committed suicide,
listen, we should have finished 4 minutes ago, but can I just have 2 more minutes, because I didn't talk about this at all. The archetypal basis of this, idealization and the idealized parent, the corresponding thing in Jungian psychology is what we call the projection of the self onto the parent. Okay, and you find this in Jung and in Neumann and Edinger write about this, and various people. And this is the idea here is that this is the bigger self is carried by the parent. This is in quotes. Okay? In other words, the child does not experience the transpersonal self except with the parent. The parent is looked up to and admired and idealized because they are carrying the projection of the self for the child. Okay? So we think that both of these are archetypal experiences of different aspects of the self, one inside, or maybe in some distorted form, and one projected onto the parent, or in therapy gets projected onto the therapist. But what we're saying here is that these things that Kohut is talking about are structurally important, therefore they are archetypal. And that's where they link up with Jung. But what we're going to have to do next week is show that for Jung, these would only be 2 components of the self. They wouldn't be the whole of the self. Okay? This would be a reasonable stopping point if people want to have any questions. Is it a one-liner or is it a...
Well, I think it was just with current infant research, there's so much of it now, what is it possible to conceive of the mother merging with the infant rather than the infant merging with the mother? If you see infant research is showing that babies are separate right away and are agents of themselves from the beginning.
Yeah, well, this takes us into Dan Stern and all that.
Well, I think the evidence that infants have quite a bit of sense of self from the very beginning and their own separateness and their own initiative is evidence for Jung's idea of the self as something that is present from the very beginning.
Yeah. And that there is a bridging theory. No, it's not saying there's most of the merger notions, but there's a difference between having a sense of self and incarnating it in behavior. Next week we can begin with Michael Fordham, who is a London Jungian who bridges Jung and Kohut very nicely with a theory called de-integration. But it would take too long to go into that. Pardon? Well, there are 2. There's this paper which is available out there, and if you want the Kohut, well, of course, there's Kohut's books which are not easy to read unless you're familiar with psychoanalytic jargon. There's a review article that I'm sorry, we must have left it at home. There's a review article which talks about Kohut in very simple terms that I've left at home. We'll bring in next week. But if you pick up a copy of this paper.
What do you call that?
Jung and Kohut. Very original title.
Is Michael Fordham the man who's speaking tomorrow night?
No, that's Anthony Stevens.
Well, thank you.
This podcast is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Share it all you like as long as you maintain the attribution to the speaker, but please do not change it or sell it. If you like this episode, tell your friends about us or leave us a review on iTunes. For more information about classes, training programs, videos, audio, this podcast, or to find a Jungian analyst near you, visit our website, www.jungchicago.org.